This past April, COVID-19 took one of America's most accomplished and beloved songwriters, John Prine. In the weeks since his passing, I've been diving deep into his collection of songs and have been blown away by the wit, sincerity, and depth of his lyrics. Today we're going to be looking at one of the songs on his self-titled debut album. The name of the song is Sam Stone, and you'll be able to see for yourself why John Prine is such a genius songwriter. Hi, I'm Brian from Unmute Your Muse TV, where we teach 5-minute masterclasses for songwriters. We use the Gold Song Solution to help you write the kinds of songs that people will love, buy, and tell their friends about. John Prine's first album was released by Atlantic Records in 1971, and even though Prine was only 24 at the time and had written a number of the songs years earlier, we can already see that in this collection of songs that he's not just any songwriter. Already at this young age, we can see his ability to weave a story and turn a phrase that's relatively well developed. Now, the song that we're looking at today, Sam Stone, is about a soldier returning home after fighting in Vietnam. And even though it was written almost 50 years ago, many of the issues are still extremely relevant today, like soldiers with PTSD, opioid addiction, and collateral damages of war. The Vietnam War was an incredibly divisive time in American politics, not too different from today, in fact. The late 60s saw a whole genre of music, the protest song, come into being. But rather than taking sides and making clear political statements, John Prine decides to tell the story of a regular soldier and what happens to him after coming home from the war. Really, Prine is not so much directly calling out the government for being involved in the war in the first place, so much as he is calling attention to the unseen effects of that war, which in and of itself showed that Prine was a little bit ahead of his time. I mean, the term PTSD hadn't even been invented yet, not to mention getting any front-page attention. So instead, the news at the time was full of high-minded political ideals, like communism versus democracy, American interventionism versus protectionism, war versus peace. And for the most part, these are the kinds of things that the protest songs are being written about. But Prine decides to take things in a totally different direction. And rather than spouting political platitudes or screaming in rage at the government, Prine tells us a story, a sad story, one that grabs the attention of people on all parts of the political spectrum because of its inherent humanness. So here's the first thing that I'd like to point out for all of us as songwriters. Sometimes when we're trying to get a point across, even a really important point that we're really passionate about, sometimes you can actually get people to pay more attention to what you have to say if you can figure out a way to personalize it. Give your listeners characters and stories and feelings that they can relate to. That way, once they're emotionally invested, they'll be much more likely to see the point that you're actually trying to make.
Sam Stone came home to his wife and family after serving in the
There are dozens of great songwriting principles that John takes advantage of in this song, and I could probably spend hours talking about them, but let me point out just a few. For one thing, so far as the lyrical structure goes, even though this is a very simple story song, John pays great attention to how things are organized. This song uses what I call a vignette style of verse organization. The verses happen in chronological order, but each one is confined to a different time period. Verse 1 is Sam Stone's homecoming, Verse 2 is his life at home, and verse 3 is his death. And all of them point back to the main theme of the song, which I would articulate as collateral damage. So let's talk about that central theme for a bit. So even though he never actually uses the phrase collateral damage, that's really kind of what the whole song is about. It means that people get damaged by events that happen near them, even if it's not exactly to them. Sam Stone didn't get hit directly by mortar fire, but he got some shrapnel in his knee. Sam Stone's doctors didn't try to give him a lifelong opioid addiction. It was an unintended consequence of the morphine that they used to treat the pain from the shrapnel injury. And Sam wasn't trying to deprive his children of nice things like new clothes, but he did, because of the drug addiction. So even if John Prine never consciously thought of the phrases collateral damage or unintended consequences, that was very much the theme of the story. And every stage of the journey reinterpreted that theme with new facts and new consequences, based on what had come before. It's just really good storytelling.
There's a hole in Daddy's arm where all the money goes.
John also uses another great songwriting technique by switching narrators between the verses and the chorus. The verses are all told from the position of what we would call the omniscient narrator. It's a third-person point of view of someone watching the events happen from a distance. But then, for the choruses, Prine switches perspectives and speaks from the point of view of one of Sam Stone's children. That takes what was already an emotional and personal song to a whole new level. The kids definitely don't understand exactly everything that's going on with their father, but Prine points out that kids can pick up on more than we might usually give them credit for. For example, the kids hopefully have no clue what it feels like to actually be addicted to opioids, but they're smart enough to know that daddy's spending all his money on drugs and not on new clothes for them. And so the kids try and put the situation in terms that they can understand. They come up with the line, "There's a hole in daddy's arm where all the money goes." And the fact that John can get so far into the head of a child is really quite profound. Now, let's talk about that line for a bit, because that seems to be the one that everybody always remembers. It's in the biggest power position in the song, the first line of the chorus. So that in and of itself makes it more memorable. And John knew that he wanted to talk about Sam's drug addiction, but he didn't want to just come out and say Sam Stone was addicted to heroin. Instead, he uses some imagery. There's a hole in daddy's arm where all the money goes. You can almost picture somebody stuffing little dollar bills into a hole in their vein. It's not really a complete metaphor in the traditional sense, because there actually are holes in Sam Stone's arms. And even though Sam's not literally shoving money in his veins, he might as well be, especially from the kid's point of view. It's a great image, and it captures the whole feel that Prine is trying to convey, the emptiness, that a hole that needs to be filled, and unsuccessful attempts to fill it, and then all of the collateral damage that those attempts cause. All in all, I think that this is just an incredibly well put together song, and I encourage you to check it out. If you're new to John Prine's music, there's no better place to start than with his first album, where you can hear the song Sam Stone, as well as quite a few other classic tunes.
Sweet songs never last too long on broken radios.
Now, before we go, there's one last thing that I'd like to say. Despite that John Prine was one of the most revered singer-songwriters in Nashville and has been around for decades, I had literally never even heard of him before he died. And this is because, and I'm a little bit ashamed to admit this, I grew up with a severe prejudice against country music. I was raised on prog rock, jazz, and classical music, the really heady, intellectual kinds of music. And for years, I felt that the simple chord progressions and melodies of country music were just beneath me. That and the fact that I thought that I couldn't relate to most of what those songs were talking about. Country music was tightly aligned with a demographic that I didn't fit into, a subculture of which I was not a part, and I looked down on it because of that. And it's really only been in the last couple of years, as I analyzed more and more country songs for my students, that I began to see the depth of artistry in a lot of country songs. No, they're not usually as flashy or complex as the prog rock and jazz that I grew up on, but there are tons of country writers who could easily teach my rock friends and I a thing or two about lyrics. The power of a good story, a good metaphor, a good turn of phrase. So my point is this: we've all got our prejudices, musical and otherwise, and that's just part of the way our brains are wired. We like what we know, what we're familiar with. But if we take the time to stop and listen, we might just discover that there are art and beauty in places that we didn't think to look, just because those places are different than what we're used to. All right, we're gonna call it a wrap for this week. Make sure to come back next week when we'll be talking about using metaphors in your songs. All right, everybody, stay safe, be joyful, keep writing.